Dear listeners of the Female Guides Requested podcast, happy Wednesday. I'm your host Ting Ting from sunny Las Vegas. Today our guest is Lyra Pierotti. Lyra has been guiding and instructing for over half of her life. She is an AMGA rock guide and Alpine guide and has just one more exam in May of 2024 to achieve full international certification. Being a woman guide has had its challenges over the years, so Lyra has managed those additional gender risks with additional work, developing an overlapping and supportive career as a personal trainer. She passed a similarly coveted certification from the NSCA in 2017 to become a certified strength and conditioning specialist. Lyra is a senior guide with Alpine Ascents International, a staff instructor trainer with AIARE, and has her own small business coaching mountain athletes called MOVEmentum. In this episode, we talk about how Lyra stumbled into guiding after college, how her love of science and art of movement served as a compass for her to navigate through different phases of her guiding career. After the injury almost ended her guiding career and athletic life, she persevered and regained her footings and used her knowledge to help other mountain athletes. She also shared her experience serving as a board member of the AMGA and offered some insights for newer guides. I really enjoyed this conversation with Lyra and wish I could talk with her for another hour or two, and I know you'll feel the same way too. Thank you so much for coming to this show. And basically this podcast is to try to profile you. So then I probably will ask you, and it's actually about guiding, obviously. It's I think your guys requested.
Yeah, what is your target audience? And I looked at a bunch of your previous podcasts. I saw you interviewed Amy Barnes, who passed recently. She was amazing.
Right.
Yeah, she was amazing. Just I'm curious what your audience or your like goal for the podcast is.
I mean, it's a good question. I started this podcast in my first episode was aired March 8th, the International Women's Day
of this year.
Oh,
you've been busy. Cool.
So it's still pretty new. I mean, it's less than a year, right? And right now I believe Julia and I are the 16th. So right now I have 16s on the internet.
Wow.
And my goal is to publish 2 episodes of profile female guides a month.
Cool.
And then I'm doing a side branch of, because we talk a lot about guiding. Originally, I just want to profile female guides because people ask me, I'm a female guide and I'm also a BIPOC, so it's not as common. So people just ask me about how easy, but how did I feel to be always kind of one of the minority.
Always.
Right? Yeah. And
in all the ways.
and then so I just like, I don't know. And then people start to ask about mentorship questions. And I haven't really been mentor other newer guys until very recently, maybe this recent 2 years. And I just like, well, my personal experience limited, so I just kind of want to ask other female guys about
That's awesome.
So just not necessarily about how they were mentored or how they mentor people, but just kind of like experience sharing. Sometimes just by sharing that, okay, we are here. So everybody is special, but we all share something in common.
Yeah.
maybe latecomer will feel a little bit less intimidated.
I love that.
Yeah. So that
Yeah.
was kind of my first goal.
Amazing.
Yeah. And then since we talk a lot about guiding, and I'm also teaching, I'm a SPI provider. I teach
Oh, that's right.
SPI
Great.
courses. And then during the SPI courses, we have to not teach in the extensive sense, but talking about professionalism, like permitting and insurance, those things. And I was just like, I really don't have a lot of knowledge about those things. And then
The
people
whole world.
ask me about how much does a guy get paid? You know, the business side. Is that be is that a real job? Can we really
Oh
make a
gosh.
career
Yeah.
out of it? It's like
Oh, such good questions.
big questions, right?
Yeah.
So, well, I mean, I definitely right now, it's my full-time job. And guiding is hard. I won't deny that. A lot of field days, and it can be really rewarding, obvious. So people is always curious about this profession.
Totally.
So there's a lot of questions related to guiding.
Oh,
Yeah. So to be honest, right now it's so new, so I'm just do it, and I haven't quite figured out a like say a mission statement quite yet.
it makes sense to me. I mean, you're expressing so many of the things that I feel like turn over in my head and to some extent are somewhat generational too,
Mm.
where there's a shift happening, I think, from like people are now getting into guiding. Whereas I feel like my generation, I kind of stumbled into it,
Oh, well, may I ask like which generation you refer to?
which I don't know. I'm
Okay.
38. So somewhere that's around like 40s
So,
ish. And I'm finding like the women in their 20s are like, that's the question. Like, how did you get into guiding? And they're in their 20s looking to get into it. And I feel like I just kind of ended up in it.
yeah, so why don't you like tell me about your story? How did you stumble into guiding?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. Should I
Yeah,
jump
let's
in?
just do it. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So the getting into guiding, gosh, so I grew up in Vallejo in California in the city, with a single mom, nowhere close to the mountains. And it was the 90s in the Bay. And there was actually a lot of like critical, I think, climbing history happening in the Bay Area around that time. Climbing gyms were starting, and a lot of like big names like, well, this may have been earlier, but Arlene Bloom was an expedition climber. She was in the Berkeley Hills, and bouldering was becoming popular. All these like Bay Area climbers going to the Sierra and then coming back and starting these climbing gyms. And so the whole climbing gym era was starting. So anyway, kind of a long way to say that planted a seed in my mind for sure, as like generally a very athletic girl, couldn't get enough of sports, really wanted to do all the extreme things, but single mom in a city close to the coast, not super accessible or available. So it was when I went to college, I got stayed in the UC system because it was an amazing education for a great price, and worked really hard and got enough money to go. And I got a mailing the summer before for what was called a wilderness orientation program. And it was through Outback Adventures at UC San Diego. Still at the time was obsessed with being a marine biologist. Somehow that got stuck. And that was the track I thought I was on. I went to this wilderness orientation program. I worked all through high school, so I saved up some money. My mom helped me pay for it. And it was like, I don't know, it was under $1,000 or something for a week-long expedition, sea kayaking or backpacking. I wanted to go sea kayaking. I was like, oh my gosh, in Baja of all places. And it was just like, well, that's a wild way to start university. So I got on that, met, of course, like amazing folks, some friends, lifelong friends, really. It was remarkable. And that turned out to be part of a bigger university recreation program. They were structured something like Outward Bound-ish, so but a university based. And they did a bunch of things. They were connected to a climbing wall on campus that was like wedged into two racquetball courts, classic like 90s or post 90s. This was 2000s by then. Then they were, what else did they do? And then they mainly coordinated a lot of trips, recreation trips, all throughout the year, culminating in the big one in the summer, which was that wilderness orientation. But you could, as a nobody, you could just show up as a student, really, and get this amazing mentorship just as part of the club. And so I joined that club. We went to, every Monday meeting. It was a great community, became all of my really close friends. And then I just happened into this community that offered mentorship on an instructor or guide kind of a track. And the way they structured it was, for the first year, when you're a freshman, you were expected to get your woofer. I think that was right. Yeah, I think that was right. So which was huge, right? Like that is a 10-day long full-time field-based or wherever you go. Like I had to go to Santa Barbara for that 10 days over spring break. And it was like, that was like the big deal for all of the freshman cohort that was trying to be what they called a trainee guide. But there I was, 18 or 19 already with a woofer, which is amazing as a guide and really helpful. And then I would have one quarter, they're on the quarter system. Every quarter I would be a trainee on a program. And I fell in love with rock climbing. It had been in there. I'd wanted to do it forever. And I was like, oh my goodness. So I was getting trained and assisting, the logistics and the people and the risk management while I was developing my rock climbing skills all along the way. So that was it. That was the in that got me. From there, then you had to, every year you became you would be a secondary guide and then a primary guide. They had a cultural element that was really a little bit funny and upside down. I don't know that it's the same now, but there was this culture that the primary guides were kind of expected to lead from behind and encourage the voices of the younger guides to be more prominent and be more like the oversight and the risk management behind the scenes, which it worked in many ways. It was really interesting. I don't think it's what they do anymore, but that set up some really neat and nurturing team dynamics that I was able to learn and be mentored through. And then that just was this amazing experience through college. Still thought I wanted to be a marine biologist. But gosh, that's then I remember turns into more elaborate stories. I'll just keep going with it. That I had been working in Scripps Institution of Oceanography in the lab there in benthic ecology. So studying bugs in the mud, basically. And getting to the end of college, I managed to study abroad twice. And for the second one, the first one was very short, went to Australia, and it was amazing. And then I was either going to graduate early, but I had some scholarship money left. And I was like, oh, it's really strangely cheap to go to France for a year as a student. So I moved to the French Alps for a year, and it was technically my senior year, is that right? Yeah, it was technically my senior year. So my fourth year, and learned that mountain guiding was a thing.
Yeah, they have a mature assistant there.
They do, like 100-year-old or something, right? So I was blown away. I was like, what? Nobody ever told me you could be a mountain guide for a living. That sounds like fun. And happened into a community. A bunch of my friends from that time are now French UIAGM or IFMGA guides, which is really sweet. So that lodged it in there. And I came home and I was like, there was no turning back. I was like, so that just kind of stuck. Still thought, because everything I knew to be like a successful young adult pointed towards, lawyer, doctor, or in my case, I really liked science. So it was like, you go get your PhD. That's what you do. And so I was on that track, kind of, or thought I was, and got a mailing in my then super senior year. I went back to San Diego, worked at REI, and pieced things together, had just a few classes to wrap up, and then was just like, okay, now what? Like, I was so heartbroken to have left France. I missed it terribly. And, but started climbing more in the Eastern Sierra, which I really hadn't done at all. I actually remember seeing a photo of the Eastern Sierra in a Patagonia store in Annecy in the French Alps and looking at it and be like, this is my next new adventure. And I look at the caption and it's It's like Bishop, California.
It's right next to home.
Yeah. And I'd never been to Bishop. I grew up in California. So I started going up to Bishop a lot and then working at REI. And I got an email from the listserv of the biology, ecology major that I was graduating from. And it was like, I opened the email and I remember being so baffled. I looked at their job posting and I thought I was reading my resume. And I was like, that's weird. How did that? And then I realized they were looking for me. Like it was just like, it wasn't that I'd done this or that or these many things, but like the really bizarre specifics of like, it was like, oh my gosh, like this is my job. And it was, they wanted outdoor and leadership experience. And I was like, oh, well, Outback Adventures, check, cool. And they wanted backpacking specifically experience, which I had been guiding backpacking. And they wanted, as a bonus, if you had any experience with science, specifically with invertebrates in the benthic or the top layer of mud, basically. And I was like, are you joking? So it was just really bizarre. And that was through the White Mountain Research, what do they call it, Center at the time in Bishop, California. And I was like, ooh, there's some connect the dots happening. So I emailed them and I was like, hey, here's my resume. Really like the sound of this position and like, let me know if we can talk more. And the scientists contacted me right away. And like, then I think it was a few weeks later, I was driving up to Bishop to meet them. And my interview consisted of a day of backcountry skiing with them. And I was an okay skier at the time, but just literally outside their back door in the Eastern Sierra where they lived. So that was like, that whisked me up to, it was a Sequoia Kings Canyon backcountry, field biology job for all of that summer, but it was based in Bishop. And so that basically moved me to the Eastern Sierra, where I spent the next several years. That fall, I was like still on the science bandwagon. I was still like, oh, this is my thing. And I was trying to think through how to go through continuing university level of education and postgraduate education, but live in Bishop. And so the whole like fall, I was working for them. I managed to extend the work that I was doing a little bit and really just trying to figure out. And eventually I was honest with myself. I was like, oh, I just want to play in the mountains for a while. Like I was trying to create a master's program and I took the GREs and found an advisor that would like work with me who was based in the Bay Area, but I wanted to be in Bishop, and it was just like, finally I was just like, what am I doing? Give me a minute. So I just like hit pause and met a bunch of local guides. And then that's probably the very long answer for, I think, the little crucial nugget in there, which was the amount of experience I had just moving people around the mountains. Not necessarily, I was guiding, basically, I was working with single pitch instructors, actually. We had to have someone on staff at UC San Diego because we operated in Joshua Tree. So that meant that AMGA was on my radar since I was like 18 or 19. I was like, oh, that's kind of a cool thing. And so I got some great mentorship and learned through following them how efficient and effective and fun that level of skill made us as a group able to climb. We climbed more, just really more easily and more, just more generally, I would say, in a day with great systems. So that was back there. So I had that exposure, that more technical rock. I had the like moving people through the mountains with backpacking. And that just kind of like rocketed me into some positions where I could assist a variety of trips for the local guide services. And then those were the big leagues, that was like real. They were a bunch of companies owned by a variety of IFMGA guides in that area. And it was just like, whoop, whoa, full circle. My first full time then, which was definitely entry level, but again, like amazing progression for a guide. My first full-time summer, the following summer, I was with Shasta Mountain Guides and tons of more like elusive skills of guiding. It wasn't like the the clear environment of rock climbing, where you tie someone in, and you have a top rope, for example, that I was accustomed to. But I was launched into the world of short roping,
more like
on
Alpine. Yeah, Alpine guiding, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So very entry level Alpine guiding, and just tons of mileage on a relatively simple objective, with great mentorship, teams everywhere, people and resources and trainings and all those things. And that was, well, the rest, I guess, is history. It just kept going from there.
So, then did you ever go back to the science related job?
That's a great question. Kind of, yes. What I realized was in my heart was more natural history and less about being in a lab. And I love the science. I love the wonder of the natural environment. I was more specifically studying ecology. And as it goes with guiding, we are pretty vulnerable to climate, and we were like 4 years into a drought in California, and California very drought prone, obviously. And that knocked out all of my winter work finally in that 4th year. Like, there was no snow. There was no ice guiding. There were no avalanche programs. There was only skiing on like one track in the ski area that they were blowing snow on. It was wild. And I had been thinking about writing. I really enjoyed writing. Not totally sure where that came from. Lots of writers in my family. But I managed to connect with the local paper and just kept persisting and wrote these little tiny blurbs and things about like the upcoming triathlon. And I was able to get in for a super part-time position as a staff writer for that winter that a lot of my other work fell away. And that was remarkable. I ended up filling a niche of science writing. And so I was able to really, because of how they were staffed, I was able to come up with a lot of my own interesting feature ideas about the local environment that I was just completely in love with, and write about it for the paper, because it was a mountain town and people were interested in that. So it came back around, and that ended up serving more, as we'll talk more, like so much of my guiding world has been about how to like support it in other ways. And the writing became the first one that was like, oh, I can also do this so that I feel more secure against things like when the climate throws a wild card, or if I'm to get injured. And developed a bunch of skills working through that editor that I worked with had been retired. He was a Wired editor back in the day, moved to the mountain town to ski and got bored. And so in retirement, came back and worked for the paper, and was just this like hilarious character and an incredible mentor to the craft of writing.
So, yeah.
So
you meant that when you mentioned that supporting guiding, you meant, say, if guiding work is thin, then you can find other, say, gig or career choices. Okay.
Yeah. Support, totally. Yeah. It, as a younger guide, I think I found it even harder to make a wage and get access to enough work to make it full time. And, for one of those years, basically lived out of my vehicle, as many young guides do at some point, to climb or ski a lot, to build your skill, and then also to cut cost.
Right. Yeah. Then, yeah, I can understand. I have a lot of friends who live in the back of the truck, trying to be frugal, right? Just like you say that when you just started, the wage is not ideal, but then you still have a lot of mileage you have to cover.
Exactly. Yeah, and the education's expensive too.
It is, and especially like in the mountain guiding, you have to be in the terrain, so you spend all those times that on your own, that not being paid. So you really have to kind of dirtbag it in a little bit. Yeah.
Totally.
And
it is and it is like I value the immersion also. I don't want to live out of my vehicle anymore. And there was a time in my life that like that was cool. It is the mountain sports really can be a very immersive kind of a sport. It's we often think of it more as a lifestyle really than than an athletic pursuit.
Yeah, I mean, I pay my due of like sleeping on the dirt, and but just like all the guys, they probably have different phases, right? So, what when did you
Like,
consider you kind of switch? Maybe I don't want to say upgrade, but because that's kind of a very variable phase too.
totally.
Um, but what I want to ask is like, when was the maybe like defining moment that you enter the next phase? And yeah,
The next
and
phase.
then
Oh,
feel
great
like
question.
a little bit more financial. I would not say
Hmm.
security, but maybe like a little bit more well off, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, a little more ease anyway. Yeah, I moved. I think the big step for me was moving from California to Washington. And that I realized the was just I was learning about how guiding works in the States. And in the Eastern Sierra, it's really far. It's hours of driving from Reno or
It
Las
is
Vegas
far too,
or Los
yes.
Angeles.
Yeah.
It's far, right? And so it doesn't have this natural
So it's not like
like on ramp.
Chamonix, you know?
It's not Chamonix, that's for sure. Or the terrain is stunning. It's some of my favorite in the world, and the access just isn't that. And then more than that, the access when people arrive in Bishop to meet you for a trip, your trailhead is often at like 7 or even sometimes 10,000 feet. And for clients to come for a long weekend trip, it's hard. It's not. And then the terrain is there's not a lot of mellow alpine terrain. It's a lot of like really hard rock climbing. And so for people to be drawn, it just really narrows the clientele potential, I think, that terrain and that style of climbing. And it's extremely fun, and you certainly can fill out a schedule, and guides do there. But what I saw, a couple parts. I moved over to Yosemite and worked for Yosemite Mountaineering School for a couple of summers. And I got through my rock climbing certification. And that was awesome. And I loved it. And like could
You mean
have
with the AMGA or okay.
correct. Yes. Yep. Yeah. So got my rock certification with AMGA. And that was really cool. And I could have like just kind of I could definitely see having a long functional life and career in that setting. But I had an inkling from my time in France that I wanted to go in more into alpine, more into skiing. And then that goes back to what I was talking about with the riding and being in Mammoth for one of those years that was so dry. I was also recognizing that like, oof, why not, if I want to keep up with snow things, I'm not sure California is going to nurture me, at least in this time and what's happening. So related to that, so I made the move north for my summer work, but still needed to figure out the winters. And I was like, oh, if climate change with all these, for example, the rim fire, the wildfire in Yosemite in 2012, we lost a month and a half of work, which was wild. And I was like, just kept experiencing these vulnerabilities. And I was like, well, if all of these big climate anomalies are going to impact my work, what are other ways for me to explore and see if this training that I'm going through that's expensive, but that I like, is it going to show up and is it a smart investment? Is it going to show up for me? So hit a pause on the expensive AMGA programs and started working the US Antarctic program, where I was jokingly, I was like, well, if climate change is going to impact my career, maybe I can go work for climate scientists in Antarctica. Which was awesome. And it was I could see like growing old in a program like that for sure, and using the skill of the guide in a way that helped scientists access terrain. And one of those projects was like ice climbing these steam vents with a young scientist she was in Christchurch, but from Sri Lanka, and did a lot of outreach. And she it was just remarkable to work with, and it felt like amazing to see my work. I would climb these ice vents and find the hole, and then I would lower her into it to go collect the gases and pull her back out, and so I was just like, oh, okay, cool, all right, starting to bring some of the science back, but in the things and the ways that I like to, and staying active. And for me, seeing all of it from the story point of view. So that was probably that next chapter, which was still really volatile. It was like winters in the Antarctic program, summers in the Northwest, and mostly in between moving up to Washington and working for a somewhat large company at that time that had a really great, a lot of really high-end technical work. And I was able to get tons of it.
Like high,
What's that?
What do you mean by high end?
Yeah, like low ratio, very technical, fairly stressful. I was doing a lot of, at the time, on-siting. So like going out on these routes that I hadn't ever climbed before with clients, like in the hot seat. And it's a lot of pressure, but incredible. The repetition I got with that in big alpine rock and glaciated routes and objectives was quite remarkable. Paid some dividends for, I think, my confidence, and also took a toll on my stress levels. So that was a significant next step, I would say.
So I have a couple questions for you. So, so you have this science background. So you say you went to Antarctica for this big science project, right? So,
yeah.
Do you feel that, well, when you were talking about writing, that was because you had a need to kind of venture outside of guiding because there was no work because of climate change.
Totally.
And then the you must like science too, but also science can kind of serve as, say, a fallback. Say if there's like little guiding work. Would they all, like did that kind of put an ease on your mind? Just like, oh, at least I have something that okay.
Absolutely.
And then you mentioned that if you study biology, you must like environmental science and all that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you say you enjoy doing athletic activities. So
yep. Yeah.
So that's probably why it took you to the mountains. Is that right?
Absolutely.
So how about guiding itself, like as a service?
Oh yeah.
Component, right? You dealing with new clients, teaching them or bring them to some objective. How about that part of work?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, that kind of gets to the soul of it. The why, like, why does this thing persist in me if it's like clearly like I'm having to cobble things together because it's stressful and it causes a lot of anxiety and it's a lot of financial burdens and potential for loss and injury and all these things and instabilities. And I definitely am not someone who thrives on instability. That has a very different answer. And I think it's a family answer. My mother was a violin teacher and I grew up watching her with her students. And so teaching where some mountain guides maybe grew up skiing and climbing, especially skiing, that one is nice to grow up with. It's harder to learn as an adult, I can attest. But I grew up watching my mother teach people how, like, not just lessons, but like a physical movement that was an expression of themselves. And
that's a beautiful
that
way
was
to
so
describe
inspiring.
that. Yes.
Mm-hmm. I've had some friends point to, I always joke that I'm like, out of a family of artists, I came out this punk athlete, like my poor mother. But I've had some friends who are artists. They're like, well, climbing and skiing are kind of like movement arts.
Yes.
Right? That really struck me when someone said that for the first time. I was like, oh, that got under there somewhere. And I think watching my mother's just a really inspiring character and managed to follow something that was so deeply important to her. She managed to make a career out of it and share it with others and create an incredible amount of financial stability as a single mom that was a violinist because she just stayed really smart and conservative. And
yeah, I mean, in the music industry, it's another hard one, right? Yeah.
Totally. She gave me a book that actually is sitting right here next to me right here. It's called The Inner Game of Tennis.
I read that book.
It's
amazing.
It is amazing. So when she was auditioning for like big symphonies when she was, in her 20s, I guess, that book was going around the music scene because of how it, and now I've been reading it because the next chapter, coming all in all kinds of directions, my next chapter has been bringing coaching, personal training into the fold. And so it was amazing when my mom was moving out. She recently moved to Italy. Our heritage is Italian. And she, cleaning her house out, found that book and she was like, hey, I think you might like this. I was just like, yep, of course. Thanks, Mom. Again.
Nice. So you witnessed like since his childhood that like your mom nurture students, uh, has this way of teaching. Did you feel that you are inspired, so you bring that into your say guiding work?
Yeah. Something I think about a lot and the guides that I've seen through the years who have stuck with it and those that kind of maybe get really frustrated and then those who go away. There's lots in all of the molds. There's lots of reasons that you might not persist. But one of the things that's jumped out to me as an important component to longevity as a guide is connecting to the clients because we're all going to go through these peaks and valleys with our own abilities. And I think it's hard if you get into climbing thinking that you're going to be a professional climber because you're not always climbing for yourself. And that can take a toll. You're often there, and it certainly has on me. Like I do a lot of self-care to stay strong and balanced with the amount that I'm climbing for I'm climbing for someone else's goals, for someone else's success or experience a lot of the time. And separate from the mountains, separate from climbing, separate from skiing, separate from all of that, it brings me great satisfaction to be with people on their journeys. And so that's where I think I've found the sustainability and inspiration with guiding more long term.
So then let's come back to this longevity topic. Because I think that, well, I talked to a bunch of different guys, and then some maybe could be really excited about it and then could burn out pretty soon, right? So, so you mentioned about the self-care, right? And then you also talking about the connection with the clients. So did you like consciously think about that? Like, do you have a plan? So just like, okay, I'm like committed to this job, which is guide. That so well, how to say that whether you feel like it's gonna be your lifelong career, right? But it's at this point, it seems like you're still pretty serious about it. So I want to push you as far as you can. What's your strategy? Like you mentioned about longevity. Yeah.
So this is a great question. Yeah, another great question and more details in there. Definitely not. I had like a chronic injury that almost ended my
Ooh.
guiding. Yeah. I hit 30 and like everything fell apart. I came back from my second Denali expedition and had accumulated. Wore a backpack that was too small probably for the year prior because it's what I could get my hands on. Classic, just like silly late 20s decisions. And I was like, no, I'm tough enough. I'm strong enough. And not necessarily doing anything else other than the mountain sports and the guiding, for my own body at that time. And I got the smackdown big time. I had so much compression in my like upper back and like the base of my neck that I was getting shooting pains down my left arm and I had to quit halfway through the guiding season. Yeah, it was scary. I just having shooting pain and not knowing if that's ever going to stop. Obviously that's scary enough. But then also that throws my work world into question. And even beyond that, my identity. And that's jarring. I'd built up so much of already most of my adult life on this one thing, this guiding and this mountain thing. So that I was going to the Antarctic program in the winters at that time. So that was fortunate because it gave me easier work and regular work through what had been previously my slowest season. And then building up the avalanche education as well. So I was able to like just start to figure out the things that weren't going to break me as badly. But in that, to get out of pain, went on just like a blitz of all body work. I went to acupuncture, massage therapy, physical therapy, saw a neck specialist, and got out of shooting pains. And literally, like, there was so much compression in my spine that I couldn't turn left.
All right.
Yeah. Like it would, like my vertebrae would just be like, nope. Like, oh, all right. And that was after I was mostly out of pain. That was not shooting pain time anymore. That was like, right. Okay, I need to turn left. So the neck specialist, worked with that one for a while longer. And I remember getting towards the end of what I was like allowed in terms of health insurance. And I got to this, I would self-report how much better I felt. And I got to like 85% of normal. And the specialist was like, great, well, that's, we're out of sessions and that's within the realm of what, we expect. So that's great. Good luck.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I said. So did I tell you I work as a mountain guide?
Right,
I need
85%
like 100.
is not gonna cut it, huh?
No, even arguably I need more than 100%. So that launched me on my own. Like if I wanted my career back, I had to figure out how to make myself durable enough for it. And that launched me on a lot of study. I went to found more a physical therapist that actually, strangely now, is one of my best friends in the world. I showed up in her office. She was, God, how did she come to me? She was in my local community, was just like this remarkable human. She'd worked at Harborview for a long time, which is a really high-end medical facility in Seattle, and then had her own thriving practice that, like, good luck getting in to see her. But I emailed her my story and she was just like, come on in, I'll make time for you. And I remember like sitting on her table or lying on her table, and she took one look at me and she was like, you haven't reached your athletic potential yet.
That's nice to hear, right?
Right. Yeah. And I reminded now that she's like one of my closest friends, I remind her of it regularly, because that was like, the anxiety that just melted out of me from that, and realizing, oh yeah,
my God, so happy
body
for you.
can heal.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah,
I was so grateful for her. And so it was still a journey. There was a lot. And even still, those things are things that I manage. But learned a lot about them. And in my case, learned that I really had to be my own best advocate. And I started taking some courses that I could find in these disciplines where I learned about movement and strength training, because as I got out of physical therapy and out of pain, there still wasn't a roadmap for me forward and back into performance. So that was where I started to try to like figure things out. And I went through a bunch of, I trained with the Postural Restoration Institute, and I learned how to improve my breathing mechanics and match that with my strength training in a way that locked my posture in so that I wouldn't injure myself in the same ways anymore. And then that was this is maybe what is this, chapter number 3, I suppose, of guiding already, in eventually becoming my other career of coaching mountain athletes.
Oh, yeah.
And that because of the work I had to do to rebuild my body and be durable enough for the things I love to do.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I admire you. I mean, this story is it's really intense. I mean, I know that you talk about the story that in a very calm and smile, and just like it seems like everything's in the past, but it's just kind of like imagine that starting from this backpack that didn't fit you, right? It something sound like so small, but then have this long lasting effect. Mm-hmm. And then if you somehow lost in any point during your recovery, then you won't be you here now. So
High stakes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I really
Mm-hmm.
admire that you like stuck with it. And I mean, it's definitely hard to say. I mean, I guess even you ask yourself how to say that whether you just rather, well, never had that process or experience. I mean, even though you are arriving in this phase 3 that uh, establish you learn a lot, establish your other career choice, right?
Absolutely.
Uh, so I'm definitely not gonna ask you a question whether you wish that it never happened because it already happened.
Right. I mean, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be impossible to
Mm-hmm.
say.
Then so
Totally.
that probably the whole thing. How long did it take? Like how was?
Yeah, all of that. Gosh, I mean, years. And there were more layers to it. I got to a point where I was out of pain and then learned more about nutrition and figured out in my 30s that I have celiac, which was surprising. But once I did figure that out, and it's rampant in Italian and Irish heritage, go figure, which is my heritage. Um, just a strange genetic anomaly, something like 1 in 5 Italians. When I go visit my mother in Italy, for example, I just show up at a restaurant, I'm like, hey, I have celiac. And they're like, cool, we gotcha. And my plate comes with a sticker on it that says approved for celiac.
Okay.
And I'm like, wow, they have a minister of food in Italy. You get a reimbursement if you have, anyway, I digress. But that was a bit of a wild card for sure. I have since heard that sometimes for women, autoimmune disorders flare or turn up in our 30s. So it could be, you also lose some of the like elasticity of your tissues in your 30s,
Right.
like
Yeah.
aging happens. That's a real thing. So a lot of that work really didn't stick as well as I would have liked it to until I figured that out. And that was probably 3 or 4 years later. So the injury struck right at 30, like clockwork. And then it was probably until it was 6 months of a fair amount of pain. And in that year, I was back to guiding. Well, what was I? I think I was mostly cragging, limited guiding for the next year. Just kind of, is that true? No, 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 no. I was back to it, but not Denali expeditions. I ditched those. And so I shifted as much of my work to be educational
Okay.
for the winter, which worked with avalanche education. And then the spring, I forget what I was doing in the spring, but I think still taking time off, mostly being a little more seasonal and younger and traveling and living in my car for those seasons. So just kind of chilling out, getting my own climbing back, learning about the movement, really restoring, honestly, relearning a lot of movement patterns as well, and retraining things, and then reestablishing like core strength, and then learning how to use it. But in that, so it lingered, and I would say it was still hard for a couple of years. And then really those gains started to take off when I was like 33, 34. And I started experiencing these like, oh, wow, that connected. I remember feeling this like incredible relaxation in my neck for the first time years later. And yeah.
So, this, I mean, what do you think your incredible resilience came from?
Oh gosh. That's a hell of a compliment. Thank you.
I was just like, I want to steal some like a secret. I'm not saying that I wanted to go through the things that you went through, but just like as long as I have maybe like half or 30% of your resilience, maybe it'll help me as I push through some stuff.
Oh my gosh. Oh, I don't know. I think you might have stumped me. No, I do have an answer. I think it was that. It was all of it, going through all of that and realizing that I could get better. And more there was the more I dug, the more relief I found. And so those things then included some harder things. Some of that was addressing mental health. And as I got on in like the acute phase of my body, I went through a lot of, just really straightforward body work. And that was like a safe entry into like our bodies are really, they express a lot of our life, a lot of our stress. They hold a lot of our stress. So as I like released the body stress, that made other layers more accessible. And some of those, then I did some art therapy early on, which was really cool, having a family of artists. And I always noticed like I would basically draw something and then reflect on it. And that was really cool. And then coming back to that best friend who was that first physical therapist that started to really, it was like, oh, your athleticism is not over, don't worry. Her kid actually had an interesting experience and pointed me towards this EMDR. And EMDR is for like if you're having like a strong reaction to needles, for example, which was her kid was having like needed to get these shots, but was having this really strong reaction and had this EMDR thing was really constructive in basically like removing this trauma that's having a non-constructive result. And so that I name it because in the guiding world, it has become more and more known as we exist in a community of people who experience them at times in our career at some point, very serious trauma. So it comes from, it's an eye movement therapy that you don't have to like talk about your stuff or anything, but it finds the ways that certain like emotions or memories or patterns or things are lodged in our bodies. And was developed by a woman and then has been used in for soldiers coming back from war. So there's an extreme side of it, but there's also just these really like benign things like, oh, like, I can't get a shot because like this is freaking me out and I don't know why. And that can completely resolve it. So it's really cool. In my case, what came out as I was coming out of injury and wanting to get back into sport, and I had my friend's voice in my head saying like, you haven't reached your potential yet. And I was like, yes, that feels so true. And I realized specifically as an adult learner skier that I would have the voice of my high school track coach in my head when I was on top of something steep and scary for me on skis. And it would make me really tense and anxious because I gave up track and field in my junior year of high school because it was too much pressure and I was fairly competitive and looking at scholarships and the coach was putting a lot of pressure on me and it wasn't fun anymore. So I dropped it entirely and joined the swim team because I thought to be a marine biologist, you got to be able to do a flip turn or a kick turn in the pool. That made much more sense. So, and I wanted to surf. I was just like, no, movement needs to be fun. It has to be fun because that's what feels good. And then I cracked under pressure and I was just like, I'm out. But his voice was coming back when I was skiing in my 30s. And so when I heard about this therapy, I was like, that could probably help. And then that was a layer. There were many surprising things that I found, just these points of tension where I held tension in my body for no apparent reason. That would dissolve. So that was a striking, like I'd come into this growth period as such a physical person. And I interact, like in my family, I interact, I feel like I am an artist like the rest of my family, but my art is like physical movement. And so like my experience with the world is strongest through that physical lens. And that was a way that brought me into an emotional healing through a very calm, but a very physical process as well. Didn't have to talk about it. I didn't have to like figure anything out even. It could just like move these things through me that were stuck.
Wow. We start all this conversation with I asked you about the self-care. And then I didn't realize I would heard this story that was very intense. So, I mean, I guess you were mentioning that back then you were like late 20s, probably like when we were like young, we always thought that we were invincible. And so now after all these years, what would you say to maybe like the younger guys about like self-care?
Yeah, well, do it before you need it. For sure. Yeah. And actually, I was just on the phone with one of my friends who is in his 30s and having a lot of wrist pain. And he's getting the feedback from his body. It's moving around. He had an elbow problem last year. He had some shoulder pain at some point, and it's moving around. So I would say the moment you start to notice that you've got these things and they're just like chasing them around, start finding the root of it, because there's always, and that's the stuff I've gotten into with my coaching and working with people coming out of similar to what I experienced, like coming out of physical therapy, coming out of pain, needing movement re-education into becoming a healthier athlete for the rest of their lives. And in order to do that, it can take, hopefully not the amount of work it took for me, but if you catch it soon and you catch it before it's shooting pains, you catch it before it shuts you down, it's really doesn't have to be scary. It can be quite straightforward. It does take time and it takes help. And so I think what I wish I had perhaps done differently was known that that was an important thing and started investing in it sooner and just making it a normal part of life, where a lot of the care we need is not going to be covered by health insurance, even if you have good insurance as a guide, which is unusual. But saving a couple $100 per month and really just budgeting that in, I think, is one of the wisest things that a guide can do for their career.
It's like invest in yourself. Yeah. So then yes. Let's talk a little bit about your coaching business. So because all those experience, and then you were forced to learn because you want to get back and try to strive for your athletic potential that I believe you probably haven't reached yet. And yeah, so when did you start? How long ago did you start officially launch your coaching business? Is that the MOVEmentum? Yes.
Correct. Yep. Yeah. So I filed that company in like 2016. And as has been kind of the theme of things in my life, that like I put it in place because I was starting to coach in needing to buffer out my, like in feeling vulnerable and coming out of injury around that time. I filed this company. It worked really well, worked better for me to handle my taxes with the local itty bitty bouldering wall that I started teaching climbing classes at, where I was living on Vashon Island in Washington at the time. And so that was 2016. And I was studying for this, to be a certified strength and conditioning specialist, which is kind of like a personal trainer, but you do have to have a 4-year degree and you're held accountable to continuing education that's rooted in science. And so that appealed to me with the science background. So I was like, oh, that's the one I want. And that's the one that you would see like, if I also had a strong background in track and field and soccer. And I was like, if all these things don't work out for me, maybe there's something there to fall back on. And that was always the acronym you would see behind the trainers that worked with NCAA teams and things like that. So I was like, okay, I'm going to study for this. And it was really hard. It was all kinds of like memorization for formulas and pathways and things that I was just like, oh my gosh, it was like the hardest thing I had done certainly since college.
So it's like a totally different 4-year degree kind of thing, like sports science. And okay.
Mm-hmm. A lot of folks that did study exercise science are basically set up for the exam. And I studied biology, but not exercise science specifically. So it was burly. It was hard. And it's hard to study when you're a guide and you're in the field all the time and you're, tired on your days off and you're an adult and you got all these things going on. So it took a really long time. And then finally I just what year was it? Must have been, I forget. I think it was 2017, but I finally just got like, okay, I have a mellow fall. I'm going to take most of September. I booked the exam and I just studied my tail off for about a month and managed to pass it. It was, again, I was not sure. It felt super hard and then did perfectly fine on it and passed. And continued picking up clients here and there and just working through this really cool facility that I had access to. And with my company, I was just noodling along, and I was like, oh, this is cool. Like, this will be nice when I want to retire from guiding, and just kept it on the side. And it was a nice little extra bit of cash here and there, and easy.
So, for example, who will be your target client?
I was entirely on Vashon Island where I was living. And so it was a lot of mountain athletes who wanted to be able to get strong and fit, but we all lived on this island. And so unless you worked as a guide and you were in the field all the time, like I was, you didn't necessarily get a lot of mountain time. So I was working with a lot of folks like that. And then some that were just really curious about a different way to be active and wanted to learn good technique at the climbing gym to climb on the wall there. And then kids groups. I was coaching a little climbing kids team for a little while. That was really fun. Across the water down in Tacoma, I worked also for Tacoma Edgeworks, which is a climbing gym and also a guide service that I worked for part-time as well. And just loved their model. It was like a gym to crag kind of model and a very holistic way of guiding, which I liked. So I just kept those around. And then pandemic hit. Which is the other, that was chapter 4. When pandemic hit, I fortunately had worked for Edgeworks a lot that winter. They nailed the paycheck protection, and so I functionally had unemployment. I couldn't even think of the word because it's not really a thing in guiding. You really don't often get much in the way of unemployment benefits, and the ways that work is structured and seasonal makes it hard. But that Paycheck Protection Act, or whatever it was, allowed me to have a reasonable income while we were all in quarantine. And then I was like bored, or like not willing to get bored. And I was like, so that retirement plan for coaching, I bet I could make some headway and get set up. And so I just started experimenting with it. Had some friends that I'd launched a whole like business platform, did all the like boring stuff behind it with like, website, with branded emails, and then started shooting a bunch of videos that were instructional along the lines of the things I had already studied to get myself out of pain, and then that I'd started sharing with my clients, and collected over the course of the quarantine something like 100 videos. Wow. Learned the back end of the apps that I could then share with or interface with clients, and then just started like taking on people part remote here and there, and just still keeping it on the side. And if I talked about it with clients, I would pick up a client here or there. And then it's kind of just been on a slow growth model, somewhat organically like that since.
Well, this year is almost done. So if you use this year as example, so what would you say your time split? Like, say how many days in the field guiding what kind of terrain, or how many days you are probably in, say, Leavenworth in your home to do that, and how many is that educational?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great. This 2023, which I will say is unrepeatable. I'd worked way too much, and then had 2 AMGA programs as well. But I'm now on a really neat salaried position with Alpine Ascents International, and super unique. They've managed to figure out, being one of the larger companies, how to provide really fair, as regular work as kind of exists, and almost year round, which is remarkable. And then I'm local. I live locally, so I work full time for them, and I'm contracted to a minimum of like 110 days per year, or at least in 2023. And then there's other tasks that I might help with, and trainings and webinars and things like that.
Like part of the requirement for being a salary employee. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So minimum that I'm in the field is over 100 days per year. Then with the AIARE instructor work, that's educational, and that's probably about 20 days of a year, and field-based, not strenuous, but still a lot of, and more somewhat local for me now, which is great. And then the coaching, I fit in the gaps. And that's harder to quantify because it'll be like hour phone calls, mostly remote, at the start of the day. And then I'm able to like spend the rest of the day skiing, or I come back and like have a couple calls in the evenings. So it's the actual, like, I guess it gets to like the number of days off that I have feel kind of minimal, but that has allowed me to have a lot of my daytimes back to myself in order to get back to my own strength training, back to my own personal rock climbing goals, my like ski objectives and things like that, which has been awesome.
I see. So you kind of so far for this year, well, you said you work a little bit too much, but basically you like that type of split, just like
I do.
And
Mm-hmm.
I know that you are still serious about guiding, and you are like one step away from getting your pin, which is AMGA guide, right? So,
yep.
Right. So what's your outlook for that? Like, why do you want to do that? And then after you gain, say, your ski, pass your ski guide, and do you? Then what? Yes, okay.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, totally. Well, so it lodged into my head almost 20 years ago as like a really cool thing. And then obviously has been quite a journey to get there with a lot of tangents and injuries and scares and things along the way. I realized just somewhat recently it was serving me every step of the way to continue that education in terms of the scope that it opened me up to for mentoring and training my colleagues, or even just the terrain that I was interested in guiding. So that was the big push. And then I got to a point where I was like, whoa, I'm really close actually. And oh yeah, this has been like an almost 20-year long dream that I've been like kind of noodling away at, but it's expensive. It's hard. It feels vulnerable. So I've had to slow down, and I've had to do it at times that like I could financially handle it, like there's significant investments. So coming up on this last one, there's this, you probably know this classic joke in the industry that like so many guides get their pin and then they quit guiding. And you're just like, but because it can be a journey, and it can take a toll. And that's fine. And also, like it can be a chapter like that, and you reach that and you go through a lot of really great training to get there. In terms of what the certification actually opens to me at this point, it's not as much about that, though. With my mother living in Italy, that is an interesting component. And I don't think I'm that interested in working a lot overseas. There's a lot of the terrain over there can be even more hazardous, and then there's a lot more people in it. And I'm not sure that's really what I'm seeking. But with my coaching as well, I'm really excited to find a balance where, with that high degree of certification as a guide, I can open up my access so that I can offer precisely what programming I want throughout the world potentially, and connect that continue to connect that with the clients I'm coaching. Yeah. And just have to connect the dots, essentially.
Because you kind of have this whole picture, right? So if you say you must have a long-term relationship probably have with quite many of your clients, right? So yeah,
totally.
And then could be like, so from the coaching and then have field days, then you can kind of build like this very complete program for this particular person.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's really neat.
Yeah. It's been rewarding. It's like the same reason that I love guiding. It just like goes a little back in time, or it reaches more components of a client's life and supporting them on the journey.
I think that for me, it's one of the most rewarding is to see them grow, right? So trying to, just like you invest in yourself and trying to figure out how you can do something to help you. And it's a very long and complex journey, and then you use this expertise to help other people. I think that's pretty cool. And then not just about a single objective or single summit.
Absolutely. It's been so inspiring. And that like I try to stay pretty picky about the clients that I take on, in part because they'll stay with me for a year often, which is amazing. And we get to know each other really well, and I get to see them through multiple objectives. And it really fills my cup to see them just like flourish and thrive, and And those things do take a long time. But for the exact same reason as I've loved guiding and seeing people on those journey, it's just added even more.
And I have a question about the mentorship component. So you went through, so you mentioned during your college, was that the Outback program?
Outback Adventures, it was called.
It seems that they have some model that built in. So every year, so there will be senior instructors that will coach or junior instructors. So there's like kind of have the mentorship built in, right? So I talk to a lot of people when they come from, say, outward bound or nose background. It seems like they really enjoying that. But somehow, say with people who probably just say, not, especially nowadays, a lot of people start just getting their cert and then started to working. It seems like this mentorship component is very hard to find. So what do you think once you start to be a more guy? Like, do you still have a lot of mentorship opportunities, or you feel like you have to seek them out?
Oh, like in my position now?
Yeah.
Yeah, like I mean, I think if I'm getting your question right, I've absolutely felt as I've gone on in time that I've still needed mentorship, and that it's gotten harder for sure to get. That's a very frustrating phenomenon, and it's great. Like I love being able to turn the other way and mentor people, because you do get like it's very reciprocal. Anytime you are a mentee or a mentor, you get a lot out of it. I have really appreciated working for Alpine Ascents, being a larger company, and that my direct oversight is an IFMGA guide who really values or understands what it's like to guide, what you need, what's hard, and then listens to his guides really well. And then the guide manager as well, who has been around with them for like 10 years and has gotten to know guiding so well, and is a woman of color herself. And so just holds so many life experiences and empathy and worldviews and things. And then their support as a team has been remarkable in helping me navigate that. We're like, hey, I still need help, and I still want to have mentorship. I don't want to be locked in this role where I'm now on the older end of things with more experience, but I'm still like stuck in between. Does that answer kind of what? I think there were a couple questions.
Yeah, so
I'm
just kind of curious because I found that unless you work for a big guide service, then they probably have some sort of structure. Say, okay, or maybe not even a structure, but they would encourage senior guys to mentor, and potentially they could pay senior guys to mentor junior guys. Right. But somehow then there's also a medium-sized or small-sized guide service. And once you become a guide, then you probably just like work alone. You have to figure things out on your own. Yeah. Yes. So I just wonder whether that's a similar experience that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. That was in that previous chapter, where I was at a slightly smaller guide service doing a lot of low ratio, high-end technical work. And kind of my answer to that was like, oh gosh, I can't do this. I have to go somewhere else. That I have it was two things. It was mentorship, but it was also collaboration and a team in the field, because I experienced just a lot of stress reduction when I had a colleague with me in the field. And that for me boosted my feeling of sustainability as a guide, where I could like, even on technical objectives, like we will often have two teams on the mountain, for example, for the North Ridge of Baker Colsham. And that's great, because you can feel really exposed on objectives like that. But more to your question, that like, yeah, that I think that is a glaring hole and a hard one in some. I think the AMGA has some resources that can help that in building community, and certainly is more able to support an independent guide model, which is harder. And that's not the model that I've really chosen, so I'm not the best to speak to it. But I think it's a really important one to promote and to support. And organizationally, that's an obvious one for it. The education track is part of that. And I always hoped I serve on the board for the AMGA. And I've always hoped to see more. Right now, there's a lot more like central focused work that needs to happen. But as things bounce back and things are already going really well again for the AMGA, and I would love to see that all grow into more of an education focus. And I think that would start to get more to what you're talking about, where in being more structurally focused on the education of guides in the United States, part of that component is and has to be mentorship. And the access to mentorship can be, like I made a big career choice. I always worked for little small companies. I own my own small company. I watched my mother run her own small company. Now I work for like the biggest company, like probably one of the biggest guiding companies maybe in the world. Like it's huge and has a really good feel. And that was a choice that I made because it connected the things that I needed.
And so you mentioned that, so you are still on the board, right? So this is your second term, is that right?
Yeah. Last year, my second term coming up.
And so when you decide to run for that, what was your initiative?
I got a phone call asking me to run.
Okay. And you just say yes?
The board. I did. Yeah. It was like a bunch of old white men, essentially. No, and middle-aged white men and younger white men. Is that even right? I don't think at the time, there was a little while I was the only woman on the board. But literally they just called me and somewhere in the community, someone had said like, hey, we think Lyra would be helpful. And boards will often do that. It's not that weird. And still the board still does that. You reach out, within your community as broadly as you can to seek the voices that you need to steer the board and to steer the organization. And so I was one of those. I got a phone call and I remember just being like, well, that's terrifying and intimidating. And yet it was also like someone on the other end of the phone with this all mostly white male organization asking me to sit at the table with them. And I was like, well, can't say no to that. So, and it was great. It's been interesting and challenging at times. And the progress and the change and the support and the collaboration, while all of those things can be very hard, has really been impressive in the 5 years that I've been there.
So were you helpful to them in the way they expect you to, or you actually add some other flavor, you think?
Ooh, I think a lot about this is kind of an answer to what you're asking. I think a lot about call out culture and call in culture. And I really value the voices that are strong and clear and direct and powerful that will call things out when they're wrong and inappropriate. And we really need those. My personality is not that. I'm a very slow thinker. And however, my strength is more in nuanced, delicate, sensitive conversations because I'm very sensitive myself. And in that role, I was able to kind of be the flip side to that. And so when we went through a lot of things that were calling out really big things, I could sit with those hard questions and people that were struggling with them and have hard conversations and not feel, related also to all the work I'd been doing with my body and just like coping mechanisms and things. I could sit with those really hard conversations in a way that was new and better and valuable and just kind of stick it out. And sometimes we wouldn't necessarily get anywhere and other times we would. And that progress just has to be slow. So yeah, does that answer that question?
So for example, what were maybe one of the difficult, hard questions that you had to discuss with people?
Some of a lot of the growth that the organization has gone through in the years I've served on the board have been, pandemic, Black Lives Matter, and some really big cultural things. The organization chose to take on diversity, equity, and inclusion in a big and a real way at a pivotal time when that work was suddenly in a limelight, and also where that work was like, there was a lot of pressure to be really visible and to be doing it. And in reality, the most effective way is to, like, I think, is to be affecting change in the places that aren't glamorous or visible. And there was catch up to, in a lot of organizations, I think a lot of white-led organizations, especially in outdoor spaces, there's just a lot of catch up to do. And there remains a lot of catch up to do. So some of those were just some interpersonal, like just chatting, because a lot of board work can be just like talking, making the relationships that you have and collaborating and sharing ideas. And some of those hard conversations were just in helping to translate what was going on for the generation that had been in charge. And it was like, oh, this is like fully support in spirit, and also it's hard and it's new, and it's a realm of things that maybe a lot of folks hadn't had to face the realities of. So that would be part of it. Then on the social side of it, but then on the structural side, there have been other things that were like not in my realm of expertise by any means, like simple things like board structures or communication, lines of communication, and just cleaning things up structurally. And those were and have been like surprisingly challenging to change at times. And I think the big thing that has shifted recently is just in a big move to make the boards smaller so that there's a lot more accountability and we can move more efficiently and make good positive changes, but also make imperfect changes and know that, like, okay, we're going to do this thing because most of us think this is a good idea. And if it doesn't work, we can change it. Like, we can go back to this, we can learn, but we're so much more light on our feet in that way. So that's been exciting. And it's I remember in that first phone call, it was the chair of the governance committee that was like, I was asking like what I should get into. He's like, this might sound crazy, but like the most exciting work is actually in governance. Oh. And it was just the structures of the things, and that stuck with me, and he was absolutely right.
Yeah. So then is this gonna be, so the second term will be the last term, is that right?
This year will be the end. Yeah.
And what would you say your biggest contribution to the board then?
Oh gosh.
Something you're proud of.
That one makes me self-conscious. I don't know. It feels like a team, for sure. It feels like a big team effort. I have felt really valued in my time on the board. And I think that I've really appreciated that because I think I tend to have a softer voice. And there have been times that I've spoken up and I've said some kind of hard things, and I've really felt listened to. And I think they are those things that, for me, having grown up in a city with a single mom and coming into a world that, even though I'm white, there is a lot I experience within my whiteness, sometimes less privilege when I'm in a white community. And that can be at times just perception, and things. It's so complex how all of our social dynamics work. But I exist, for example, around a lot of people that grew up skiing. And I come from like that was economically way out of the question for me growing up. So that would describe some of where, like, in my experience as a white person, where I sit. And so it has for me been really, as I've spoken up a little more to like voice these other experiences, I've had a lot of gratitude and a lot of appreciation, and that has in turn reminded me of like, oh yeah, there are some things I've been closer to throughout my life that others haven't, and just sharing that has helped to bridge an understanding that I think previously when had been conflict for them in the rest of their world, and like a block in interacting with someone who was that different. But because I'm sitting there as another white person, I think that was for me really meaningful, made it feel important. And I think on that, the other part of all of that, I think the other really important thing I've felt has been to be the voice of the students on the board, and really trying, because I've still been being on the board, I've always been still going through mountain guide programs. And I think that's an exceedingly important role or person to have serving on the board. A lot of educational organizations have a similar structure where they have like a student representative that voices the students to the board. And so that, I think I learned, was really important to have direct access to, like, what do students experience? What do we hear? And that's something that I hope they retain after I term off next year.
And then serving on the board is mostly like volunteer, right? So what do you think, how much time commitment or effort commitment that hard to count, huh?
Hard, yeah, totally. And I think very variable. And I would say, I think probably changing, because we did just shrink the size of the board. And so I think there will be more time commitment. But it also is, I think, a lot more fun, and we affect change in more ways. Whereas before, you'd be on a meeting and you'd just be like, kind of like not really knowing what was going to come of any of it, or what you were really doing, or what your contribution was. So I wouldn't call it a part-time job. I think that's unfair. I think for some people, like the board chair, definitely a part-time job. And then I think it just depends how many committees you opt into.
And then, so say you say you initially received the phone call. They say, okay, Lyra might be useful, helpful here. Do you know what was the intention they thought that you might be helpful? Is because to add some difference to the board, or diversity in the board?
Yeah, totally. No, there's that. I have a funny answer for that one. So yeah, they definitely wanted to have a woman on the board, and I think there was some of my people in my community that knew me. And when I got on the board, I was instantly assigned to chair the brand new DEI committee. And I remember just being like, oh my goodness, right. So they got one woman on the board, and they're like, so we've got this new committee and you're going to chair it. And I was like, okay. I'm like, zero skill. I don't know at all. And you don't have to be, it is that kind of work. It's important for everyone to be doing it, and willing to learn. And I knew a lot about guiding. And so that was.
So yeah. Like right now, say you might leave the board in another year, right? So if you somehow need to call somebody, say, hey, so if you are become the recruiter for the board, like what kind of quality you think the board right now needs?
Yeah, great. I love that question. So one of the committees that I also serve on now is the nominations committee, because I was hoping we could take it beyond the how do you decide to call that person on the phone? I was so grateful they did, and they had a process at the time, and it's worth just continuing to build on that process. So that the board will and does now reach out much more specifically, and has a really good handle on the balance of things, even down to, I forget what it is exactly, but like this many IFMGA guides, this many single discipline certified guides, so that we have those voices, as well as a bunch of appointed financial advice, which is awesome, who may also be guides. So there is clear directive when nominations come up again. The office communicates those And then offline, all of us who serve on the board have our networks as well. And I've been putting out to my community for a little while already, just getting the idea in the backs of some minds for some folks that I'm like, oh, this person, you hear this person's at board meetings all the time already, and this person is really vocal in this space, just community leaders that pop up already. And so I've been just kind of like planting that idea where I can to get, just have people think about it, because it is a commitment. But for now, to answer your question more, I think things are moving forward in a fairly balanced way, which is really cool. And the last board meeting was really, really fun to be part of, with a new collection of appointed board members from industries that I don't interact with as much, which is very cool. And so when the next cycle comes around, I would just say for folks to keep their eyes on their inboxes and watch for the calls for nominations and the specifics. I think the common one is probably that we'd never hear enough from is the single pitch instructor and community. That's a big one.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I'll definitely, when I teach a CI or do an SPR assessment, I would let them know that maybe they'll be interested. And some folks will be interested in that.
Yeah. And providers like yourself as well.
And I know that, Lyra, you wear a lot of hats. And then also this coming weekend, right, you're going to a Mountaineer Leadership Conference. And what was that conference about?
Yeah, this conference, it's a really neat thing. It's to support, so the Mountaineers is a Seattle-based nonprofit that it's like a community. It's not a guide service. It's volunteers who lead trips.
They are famous. They have long history. Yeah.
But they are famous. Yeah, long history, very long history. And a lot of people, that's how they get into climbing in the Northwest, is they take these like basic climbing course, which it's about a year long, and there's different modules. And so it's an amazing public access to climbing, technique, and know-how and expertise and mentorship, as we're talking about, for a great price, which guiding is not. Guiding is expensive. So I really appreciate the things that they do. And this leadership conference they have once a year. I think they skipped during pandemic a little bit, but the leadership conference brings together speakers from like Liz Riggs-Meter is speaking from AIARE. I think about something along the lines of like the humans and high risk environments and education and reflecting on like long-term learning processes. She's the program director for the Avalanche Education, a brilliant mind around those things. And then I'm speaking on this one for training for mountaineering, with the angle. What they asked me to do was, knowing that I serve on the DEI committee at the AMGA, they were like, hey, can you speak on something in equity and inclusion? And I was like, can I talk about how training athletes, it's important to understand each athlete's personal experience. Because the biggest thing, I remember guiding an older woman on the Easton Glacier, that I was able to just talk to her about for each move and get her to move a little bit better. And she did not bonk. She just like cruised right up that mountain. And it was like, she was at her max probably the whole time and did not waver. And I just remember, and she was probably 60 and had never climbed a mountain before. And I was just like, huh. And I've been studying myself, the female physiology specifically in the last year of my coaching. There's been a lot, like research is finally starting to grow a little bit. We went from like 4% of exercise science research done on women to 6% this year, which is cool. Yeah, great. It's like exponential growth. But that's getting better. But my favorite takeaway is, and the message that I have for a lot of my colleagues as I'm bridging the coaching and the guiding world, and that I want to share with that community, is just always checking our bias and how we often assess our clients through a very classically male athletic bias, which is, there's a lot of reasons for it, and these things should not have value attached to them, though they are, or that they often do. But the male athlete, classically, stereotypically, strength and power, bigger body size, larger heart and lungs for their body size. Even like if it was same female body to male, you're going to have a larger heart and larger lungs in the male. And so the amount of force and power and all those things, you can't compete head to head for the same size body. However, there's lots of other ways to be an athlete. Endurance, extreme endurance, is like the estrogen in the female physiology predisposes athletes to extreme endurance. And the more things that I'm reading about and learning about, with all the like women winning long foot races outright, or swimming in particular, long distance swims, crazy records held by women. And there's a lot of like the regularity and pacing and the nervous system and regulation that allows women to show up consistently over extreme lengths of time and perform. And so what I've noticed with some of my colleagues guiding is that they will spin, that's our term for like turn a woman around, who could absolutely have made it if they just took the pace back one notch, and not even to a pace that's below standard, but just like, if that might just be a shorter stride length, that might just be like one notch slower, and that those women are bonk proof, and it's awesome.
Interesting. Yeah. So wow, I wish the 6% research is gonna go up to 8% and maybe 12%. Then we will learn more incredible things about women athletes. Yeah,
totally.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So I was just talking with you, so fun, and then we are already an hour and a half. At least.
Your questions are wonderful. You're connecting all the dots. That's really nice.
Thank you. And so I also want to, usually I would like to ask this big question. Is I say if a listener listen to this episode and they can only take one thing away, what would you wish them take away?
I think, given like the audience I'm thinking of, like guides maybe to be, or guides mid career or wherever, I think that it's really important to know that you're in the right place for yourself, that you're doing the right thing, you're in the right place.
And how do they know? Oh, you have to believe.
How do they know? Well, I think it's maybe it's the thing that's there when everything else is scraped away. It's the what just feels unquestionable or unwavering or non-negotiable. And if guiding is that for you, then it is so worth it to make everything else happen, to make all the details work. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Because at the core, I find it to be, I think, one of the most gratifying things, and also one of the most important, actually, if I'm totally honest. It seems like such a silly, like there's the catchphrase, the conquerors of the useless.
Yes.
With the old, right? And there's some truth to it. And yet at the same time, I think that guides can and do serve as stewards for the mountains, and that those mountains need a voice, and they're changing.
Yeah. It's like a lot of guys work as front line, so like you see the climate change can definitely could affect our likelihood.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's front row view for sure.
Whew. Wow. And so thank you so much for doing this interview with me. I know that you're probably very busy. It
was nice to chat. Thank you for reaching out.
And so if people want to connect with you, say, they're interested in your coaching, or they want to hire you when they go up to, say, Northwest, Is that your the main region you work as a guide, Northwest?
It
Okay.
is. Yep. Yeah, I'm mostly local
Yeah.
anymore.
So,
Yeah.
how should I find you?
Easiest is probably my website,
Okay.
movementumtraining.com. MOVE Mentum
Yeah. All right.
training.
So on that website, you will have also the contact info. Then they can reach out for
Yep.
you to you.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
great. And my family actually
Yeah.
live in Seattle area. So if some, so sometimes I go up there. I live in Las Vegas, but I do go up there in summertime.
That's right.
Sometimes maybe we could,
Oh, you'll come and say
yeah,
hi. Yeah.
connect in
We'll
person.
time.
Yeah, when I'm there.
That would be
Great.
great.
Cool. Thank you so much for your time.